In today's video, you're going to learn how to stick a texture to a bunch of dynamic pieces in Cinema 4D. It may not make a lot of sense right now, but wait till you see this in action. Hey everybody, it's Nick here again from Greyscalegorilla.com, bringing you the tools, training, and tutorials to help make you a better motion designer. Now today's technique is really unique. I can't wait to show you this one. But before we get started, if you haven't already checked it out, we have a completely free training series called Intro to Cinema 4D, which is over 30 hours and it's completely free. You can sign up for it over at our website. I'm going to put the link down below and also right here on YouTube as well. All right, and with that, let's head on into today's tutorial and see what we're making. So today's video is all about this technique about dropping clones in Cinema 4D, and then wherever they come to rest, that there's a visible logo or a word or an image there that it makes. If you've ever seen the title sequence to Benjamin Button, you may have an idea of what we're about to accomplish today. Now this technique took a lot of different ways to approach it, and it wasn't until a friend of ours came and helped us directly that we even figured this part out. So it's a really fun tutorial. We explore some parts of Cinema 4D that I've never really messed with before. So get your notebook out. This is a really fun one, and let's head on into Cinema 4D and let's get started right now.
Let's just make this really simple. I'm going to start with a cube and make those little kind of chiclet gum things. So I'm just going to shrink down this cube, kind of make it small. And remember, with dynamics, you know, the size of objects matter. So the smaller I make these, the smaller the quicker they will fall and all that stuff. So I'm going to grab the cube. I'm going to add a fillet, and I'm just going to make it really simple. Maybe 1 or 2 subdivisions, and maybe just 2 centimeters or something like that. So that works well enough. And we're going to clone this thing. So let's go to Mograph object. Let's go to cloner and add it to the cloner. And we're going to use a grid array. And we're just going to pile these up. So we need a bunch of them. And we're just going to pile up this way, pile up this way. So we have a bunch here. Very quick setup. Again, I just wanted to show you guys the basic setup so you guys can get moving on it. And then we'll go into kind of a full tutorial after this. Okay, so let's move up the pile and let's add the dynamics tag. So we're going to go to simulation, rigid body, and then that's it. And then let's go to the floor and add a simulation collider body. And now everything should fall into a big pile, and there you go. And see how they kind of bounce when they hit the floor? They kind of boom. So the only thing I'm going to add now is just a little bit of a random effector, just so we can get a more natural fall. So go to Mograph, effector, random, and maybe not that much, maybe like 10 centimeters a piece. And now they fall a little bit more naturally, less bounce, right? Okay, so one thing we're seeing is that they're spreading all over the place. And this is this always happens. Like the particles are just sliding around like they're on ice. And that's because the natural friction, or the default friction on these tags, is set pretty low. It's set to 30%. So I like to crank this up high, like way too high at first, because I think it gives you a more natural feel, especially something like wood or something a little more sticky. So now they fall and they kind of look a little bit more natural. You could turn this down if you want, but we kind of want them to pile up because we want to project this image onto them. So now we're at the point where we need to project this image and make it stick to these tiles. So we got to create a new material, and we're going to open this up, go to color, and in my case, I have this logo here that is the logo and the script here. So I'm going to open that up. It's not in the search path. I'll say no. It'll just keep it where it is. And I'm going to apply this to our cube. And by default, it's going to be applied to every cube. What we want is for this to be projected through a camera. So select the texture, and instead of UV mapping, you want camera mapping. And then you need a camera. So grab a camera and then select that texture, and you'll see that there's a little tab here for camera. Pull that camera in, and now we're projecting from our camera. And if we turn on that camera, now we can look through the camera and project onto it. So far, so good. This is probably stuff you guys have used or seen before. So let's set this up. We have to grab the texture and kind of shrink it a little bit. It's a little stretched, so let's just get the proportions right there. and we'll just slide it over a little bit so it's centered. I still think it's a little stretched. There we go. And we're just centering it. And if you're getting tiling, you can turn off the tiling as well if you don't want that. So it looks like we're okay here. Let's say that is our final kind of position. You want to make sure everything's being visualized. You could do a quick render. Now, I could see through the head a little bit here, and it's okay. This is just a quick little test. We could tweak this later, but I want you guys to get the main effect here. And now this is how you make it stick. So we've all probably been here where you've projected something, but then if you hit play, it just kind of always projects. It's not actually stuck to the tiles. And that's what I've always wanted, was the ability to take a snapshot of where we are right now on frame 71, wherever we are, and say, okay, all of you current objects, think about what texture is touching you right now, and just grab onto it. Make that object stick. So, I thought about stick texture tags, and we've tried a bunch of different techniques, but nothing worked as well and pretty much at all, other than this technique, which is what we saw in this video here with Farzin showed us. So let's do that right now. So what he did is he made it editable. So he made his cube editable first of all. So let's hit C to make it editable. And then he made all of the clones editable. Now, that's the only drawback, is it's not totally easy to refresh. If you make any adjustments to your dynamic simulation or anything like that, of course, you're going to have to go back and redo all this. In fact, it might be a good idea to just copy a version of your cloner and just turn it off in case you ever have to go back to that. You have it. But now what you do is you hit C on the cloner, and what that's going to do is produce a clone for every clone in the scene. So it looks like we have almost 300 clones. They all have a texture tag on them. They all have this UV tag on them, and they're all sitting there. Now, let's rewind and hit play, and you see mostly nothing's changed. We just, instead of using a cloner, we have a bunch of versions now of this clone, and so this is where we need to kind of stick everything to. And you can see our dynamics changed a little bit as well. I think that's because I hit C not on frame 1. So let's go back to frame 1 and hit C, and now we have our clones. Let's hit play now and make sure our dynamics is doing what we want it to do. It's spreading out a little bit further, and this is actually something that I've been struggling with, of different dynamics based on if you have a cloner or if you don't, right? But let's just move forward with this so we could get this going, and then let's go back and we'll try to clean this up. So let's say that's where we want it to stick, and this is the important part. If this is where you want it to stick, then you keep it on that frame, and you go, first of all, delete all the existing UV tags. So I selected the first one, I scroll to the bottom, I shift select the last one, and I delete the current UV tags. Then what I do is I grab all the textures. So I'm going to select the bottom one, scroll up to the top, select the top one, go to tags, and this is the magic. This is that button that says, hey, wherever you are, stick the texture forever. And it's right here. It's generate UV coordinates. And if I click that, then I rewind. Now you can see everything is kind of where it is. It's this puzzle that is only put together when we hit play and the dynamics fall. So now the dynamics fall and everything goes right. Everything falls into place. Look at that. And then by frame 71, it's right about there, the logo is ready to be visible. Now, depending on how early or late you do this, sometimes it kind of falls into place and then it shifts out of place. And it's all dependent on where you stick that texture. So if you really want it to be visible, you'd want to kind of push this later and then stick it on a later frame. If you want it to kind of go in and out of being visible, you could do this earlier. So now let's watch that again. It's all kind of random. You don't know what it is. And then slowly it's like a puzzle being put together. It's a really cool really cool idea. And I could see this being used in a lot of ways. You know, maybe it's, I played around with some dominoes earlier in the week, you know, like dominoes falling and having a visible thing, or maybe it's papers flying around and falling onto the ground and assembling some sort of like message or image or something like that. So it's a really cool idea. So that is, I guess that is the part of the tutorial that it describes the actual technology behind this, the actual technique, right? And that's all you need to know. You know, do your dynamics, find out where you want it to stick, and then apply that. You know, delete your tag and apply that. Generate UV coordinates, and then you're good to go. So if that's what you're looking for, man, go make something cool. But let's stick around if you want, and I'll show you the kind of final pieces of that other tutorial. Which is just above this. You can see like the final render of all this gum like falling on the ground. Let's go ahead and do that. All right, so I'm going to delete that other clone, and we're just going to turn on our copy that we made, and I'm going to make another copy. And I'm always making copies just in case something happens like what happened there. Remember our stuff like fell too wide when it fell on the ground? Well, now I had a copy that I could just copy and paste, and now I'm kind of back to where I started. So let's see if we can't get those dynamics a little bit nicer, and then we'll talk about lighting and finishing the texturing and all this stuff. So here we go. We have all of these, all this gum here flying around, and see, it looks like it's just a slightly different, texture. Or something changed when we made this editable that allowed all these things to fly out a little bit further. So one thing I'm going to do is grab the floor, and I think the friction's as high as we need it on the floor. Let's grab this other tag and go mess with our friction here. Maybe turn this up a little bit as well. Because what we want it to do is create a pile. We don't want it to hit and scatter all over the place, but we do want it to look natural. And this is always something tricky with dynamics, at least with me, is you know what you want these things to do, but you kind of have to pre-set them up. You can't direct the dynamics, or else it won't look dynamic, right? You have to kind of let it do what it does. So for getting dynamics to do what you want, it's all about it's all about setting it up the right way, right? It's that Rube Goldberg machine that you can only touch one end of it. And then however you set up the middle part of it, and however you set up the whole machine, is how the finale will happen, right? You don't have any direct force over the end of this. All you have is being able to set that up. I hope that's clear. It didn't come out as as well as it could have. But let's set this up the right way so we get our desired results. So one thing we could do is make sure that these aren't touching. Because one thing they're doing is kind of, they have a lot of kind of energy when they hit the ground, and they're really, really spreading out. So let's see if we can't fix that a little bit. First of all, by getting them closer to the ground. So let's do that. So that'll keep our pile a little bit smaller. The other thing I'd like to do is stretch up on this y-axis here, just so we give a little bit more space, and actually just a little bit more space in general. That way they're not all hitting each other, and they hopefully fall into a tighter little pile. So they have that little bounce, and this is already a better pile. Now you see just that little tweak, getting it closer to the floor and adjusting a little bit of the spacing between all these objects gave us an entirely different pile. And that's just the way, we need to work with dynamics. Is experimentation, right? So that proved to be a lot nicer pile. Let's use this pile. So let's make sure we have our dynamics right, and we have to make this editable. So let's go through the process very quickly. Let's make our cloner editable. We have our original just in case this all goes crazy. And I messed it up again. Let's go to the first frame, make it editable, and let's play through and see if the dynamics are similar. Good, it forms a nice tight pile, and we still have a little bit of spacing, but that doesn't bother me. I think this might be a good place to do it. So it looks like the logo is visible. It looks like the words are visible, and it looks like it's later enough in the dynamic simulation that things aren't going to move too much. So that looks pretty good. So let's go through the process and stick this thing. So let's grab the UVs, delete them. Let's grab the textures and grab them, and then go generate UV coordinates. Got it? And then we'll close up our cloner. Let's go back to frame 0 and hit render. And now hopefully everything will fall right into place. And in fact, you can see the tiles on the outside are kind of falling around. This looks good. Okay, so that's it. So that is essentially our animation. Now our texture is baked onto it. The only other thing we have to do is do that camera animation and do some lighting, and I think we'll be all set to go. So let's talk about the camera animation. The camera animation happens in 2 parts. So let's grab let's grab a new camera. Let's just let these fall real quick, and just so we could kind of get our general frame. As always, when I work with cameras, I like to not always work linearly. I don't want to necessarily start at frame 0 and start animating a camera. A camera usually has like an end point. A nice end frame or keyframe or whatever you want to call that, that shows the main part of what you're trying to show, right? So I always like to start there. So let's grab a camera and let's look through it, and you can see we're pretty much there. It's actually really similar to our projection camera, but let's call this render just so we don't get them confused. And let's move this around so we could zoom in and get a nice little frame of the logo, of all the stuff around it. And that might be a pretty good frame right there. Okay, so that is basically frame, you know, the main frame. So what I want it to do, and if you've seen the animation that this is kind of, that's already done of this, that's in this blog post, you'll see the camera kind of tilts up and then it zooms out kind of slowly. So I want to set the second keyframe of that first. So that's where we are now. So let's grab our camera, make sure we're on our render camera, and everything's selected, and we just hit keyframe, and that's one of our keyframes, right? So the other thing I want to do is go back to the first frame and kind of get a more of an overview frame of all this gum or whatever this is kind of hovering around. So I actually, maybe it's more of a low shot like this. So let's try this, knowing that we could change it. Click render, or click add keyframe, and now we have 2 keyframes. It's going to start here, and it's going to kind of pan up and over. And here it goes. And that's our main move. So from the front of the pile up and over to the top. But I wanted to add a secondary move. And a secondary move can be tricky if you already have a primary move, right? You have this primary camera move that you really like and you don't want to mess with it. Well, if you go in and start messing with the actual camera keyframes, well, you're going to mess with this move, which you don't want, right? Let's say we love this, right? Or let's say the client loves this. Let's say everybody loves this. Let's not mess with this. But if you want to add a slow kind of zoom out kind of look, and you don't want to mess with your original camera, you could just add a null and animate that separately. So let me show you that. Let's add a null. Let's go back to frame 0, and let's attach the camera to the null. So now what we're going to do is we're going to keep the camera animation identical to what it was, and the null is the only thing we're going to animate, and that's just going to go up. Okay, so let's set a keyframe. In fact, let's just not look through our render camera so we can see what's going on. You can see we have our projection camera, which is basically dead at this point, so let's just turn it off. We don't need that projection camera because it's already, all the textures are already stuck to it. So we have our camera here that's doing its thing. It's kind of doing this move right there, right? Got it? It's attached to the null. Let's add a keyframe at 0. In this case, we only need position, so let's turn off everything else in our keyframe selector here, and let's hit render. I'm sorry, not render. Let's hit make keyframe, which is this button right here. And let's go all the way to the end of the comp. In fact, let's make this a little bit longer, maybe 150. So we kind of have this nice zoom out. And then let's take that null and move it up. You can see our camera is moving up as well. And that is what we want. So let's say that's good enough. just a subtle zoom out. You guys have seen this in a lot of camera animations where there's what I call the primary camera animation, which is like the big move, but then let's say there's that zoom out, and that's what we just created with the null. So now the camera's doing its thing, and now hopefully we get to this final lockup, and now we have this nice zoom out that's happening. And that is done by basically animating two separate objects. And if we want the zoom out to be slower or faster, it doesn't mess with our original camera. Okay, so this is looking pretty good. Okay, so where are we now? So let's finish our texturing and our lighting. Now that we have an animation that we're happy with. In fact, sometimes at this point, before we have the texturing and rendering kind of stuff to do, I'd like to do like a little test to make sure that it's looking okay. So let's just do like a standard render with no lights and no nothing, right? Just to see if the animation is correct. We have everything set up. I have 1280 by 720. I have a frame rate of 24, and I'm going to go to render all frames, okay? And I'm going to start rendering this in the background here. And I could shrink this so we can see it. So let's go 25 maybe. Perfect. Okay, so that's going to render in the background. And that should be done here while we start to texture this scene. So let's add, let's start with lighting. In this case, for the render that you've seen above this, like what this is based off of, I used the physical render and global illumination, and I used, let's get in here, I used the HDR Studio Pack and the new HDR rig that has, by the way, the floor built in. And I know I did a video on this, but I've been getting a lot of email and stuff on it. If you guys have the HDR Studio Rig and you're like, where the heck is the seamless floor? It's built in now to the rig. So it's right here in a tab. So what we're going to do is we have two floors now. We have our original floor, which is used for dynamics. Then we have this studio floor, which is used to light the background and stuff like that. If you don't want to mess around with dynamics, if the dynamics are fine, which we can't, actually we shouldn't mess around with dynamics because our simulation is all set up here, and we don't want to mess with anything because then it's going to mess with our texture, right? So what we could do is just hide our floor from the render. So these traffic lights here, we can hold down Option or Alt and click twice, and you're going to get two red lights. And that means it's still going to be dynamic. It's still going to be usable on the floor or as dynamics, but it just won't be visible in the renderer or the editor, right? And in its place, we're going to put the HDR Studio Rig floor, which has that seamless floor built in, and then we can start to texture everything. So the HDR Studio Rig did two things. It added the floor. It also added some things to reflect and light the scene. So now we have, if we kind of fly out here, now we have an HDR that's lighting all these objects. So what we could do is, first of all, add reflection to our little gum pieces here. So just a little reflection will go a long way. Let's add a Fresnel channel and just knock both of these way down. We don't need a ton of reflection. And because we're using the physical render and we can get away with this, blurry reflections, just a little bit, just to, again, give it a little bit of texture to this gum thing so it's not just this pure shiny object. Okay, so now we have reflections. You can see we're getting a little reflection here and there. Maybe we could turn it up right now just so we could make sure everything's working. And then kind of dial it back for taste later. Okay, cool. So now we're getting reflections here, but no lighting. We still have default lighting. Let's go into our render settings, go to physical, and in our physical render settings, we're going to leave everything as it is. Now, I do have an HDRI video coming soon about talking about all the different ways to light with GI and what to use in what version, because there's been some big changes. But for now, I'll tell you, in 13, you want to use an indirect illumination. In 14, and actually, I should say, in 12 and back, you don't have the physical render. So you could use regular GI here. in this case, if you have 13, you could use indirect illumination. And if you have 14, what you want to do is leave that off and go to global illumination and set this to QMC. And again, I'll go into more of this stuff in another video, but for now, that's what we're going to use for this render. I'm going to turn the gamma up a bit because this is a really bright scene, really white. I don't want dark shadows. And the last thing we'll do, actually, let's just do that standard default whatever. Let's grab an interactive render region and just see what happens. So you can see it's rendering through, and we get this really nice shadowing, really nice detail in our shadows, and our logo pops out there right in the middle. We have this nice bright white scene. Let's zoom out a little bit and see what we have. And so let's see what we could do with the render time. You can see even at half res, you know, this is kind of going a little bit slow. So let me show you one setting that you could tweak to slow or to speed up your render. Under global illumination, under QMC, if you're using 14, this only works in 14 and up, by the way. You go to sampling, and right now it's got this default medium. Now you can knock this to low and go back and see what it is, but really all this is doing is changing the accuracy or the sample count. What I like to use is the sample count. I like going custom sample count and just changing this number. And this is the number that changes the quality versus accuracy versus speed number. So, right? So if we leave it somewhat low at 64 and we go back and look again, it's going to start to render, but it's going to be a little bit more grainy. You can see the grain. That's a subtle change, but there's a little bit more grain in the scene, but you can see it rendered much faster than before. So this is your dial. This is your little dial. Imagine it's like a little thumb dial. The lower this goes, if we go to sample count 10, this will render much faster. In fact, let me just change this so we can see it. Okay, so now it's rendering much faster, but you can see all the grain that's popping up. So dial that to taste and basically to time. You know, how much time do you have? Let's set this back to something like 70 for us and kind of look at what this scene is looking like here. This is looking pretty good. Now, I would probably brighten up the in the Studio Rig to go back to the studio controls and maybe brighten up that rig a little bit. And you can also rotate the rig. Let's turn on preview real quick, and we could rotate this rig around to kind of think about which way we want the light to come from. So do we want it to mostly come from above? Well, we could do that and then look at a render like that. And you can see now we have a ton of reflections and stuff on tiles that are aiming upwards. And then it gets a little darker on the bottom side with shadows. This actually has a pretty nice look. But I might angle it a little bit off to the kind of upper left. And this gives us, again, nice reflections over here, and it gets a little more shadowy on this side. Just gives us a sense of direction on where the light's coming from. But again, really soft shadows, really nice render going on here. Cool. So that is it, right? So let's see how our picture viewer did. Let's go in and hit play and see what we got. So there's our camera move, and there's our zoom out, and there's our particle clones, whatever you want to call them, kind of piling on. And that's it. That's our move. Boom, boom, boom. So as long as we're happy with that, that only took, a minute to render. You want to make sure you do this before you go do your final render, before you see the animation, because seeing your animation play back at full speed, see how fast this plays, right? Is much, much different than going and looking in your viewport and going back and playing, because check out the viewport. See how slow that's moving, right? And I got our preview on. We could probably turn that off. But you could see the point, right? Even though this looks right, maybe this is how slow you wanted it. But then you go into your final render and you do a render, and it's like, wow, I didn't realize it was this fast. Look at how fast these particles fall. So always make sure you do these little tests. All right, I think we're good. We've done a render, we've done our lighting, and I guess the last thing we would do is do like one fully rendered frame to test your render settings, to make sure that it's not too grainy, and make sure that, you know, everything's looking okay. So let's do a render. And that's looking pretty good. It's a little grainy. If I had more time, well, basically depending on your render time, you could turn up that quality setting I showed you and get rid of a little bit of this grain in here. It's really not so bad, but that's the number to tweak. Again, it's global illumination, sampling, custom sample count. Make sure you're using QMC, and turn this dude up if you need more quality and less and more render time. But that's it.
Thanks again for watching, everybody. And hey, if you make something based on this tutorial, we would love to see the results. Post it down in the YouTube comments or over at our blog. We'd love to see what you've made using this technique. And as always, thank you so much for watching our tutorials. We have plenty more over at YouTube and at our website at Greyscalegorilla.com/tutorials. And don't forget to sign up for our Intro to Cinema 4D series if you're just getting started or want to learn more about other parts of Cinema 4D that you haven't quite messed with yet. Head on over to our site and I'll link it up down below for you as well. All right, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in another tutorial really soon. Keep rendering, everybody. Bye-bye. I got no good bloopers on that one, so I think I'm just gonna stare at the camera uncomfortably for a while and see how long you stick around. Okay, bye everybody.